Fleet Street. For 90 years or more, this was the heart of the newspaper industry. For generations of newsmen, it was the street of adventure, the summit of ambition, the only place to be. Editors, reporters, subs, photographers, comps, clerks, printers, packers, and a host of other specialists, they were part of the nightly miracle which is the production of a daily newspaper. Among the people who worked on this street were serious thinkers, serious drinkers, great writers, hard workers, and the occasional genius. Fleet Street's newsrooms, machine rooms, pubs and clubs could embrace them all, and they made it what it was, a boisterous place of rumor and gossip, of headlines and deadlines, of hot metal and hot stories. And for nearly 90 years, it was the home of the Daily Express. Now it's a different Fleet Street. The newspapers have gone. In their place are banks and building societies. The pubs are still there, but not the journalists. Fleet Street has changed because newspapers have changed. New computerized production technology has advanced at a pace only dreamed of a decade ago and has swept the entire industry along with it, out of Fleet Street and into a new age. Even the Express building has changed hands. But change has always been part of the Express throughout its 90-year history. It was always a paper of ideas and of innovation, an individual newspaper right from the start. At the turn of the 20th century, the Times had already been publishing for 115 years, but there was a demand for more popular newspapers. Alfred Harmsworth accurately guessed the trend and launched the very successful Daily Mail. He was later to become Lord Northcliffe, to own the Times and to make a fortune from newspapers. But he wasn't alone in seeing the possibility of finding success on Fleet Street. Arthur Pearson, son of a Somerset parson, began like Northcliffe with popular penny magazines. And like Northcliffe, he too launched a newspaper. It was in April 1900, and it was the Daily Express. 90 years after its launch, the Daily Express is still one of Britain's leading dailies, one of 4 major publications of Express newspapers, and all are housed in the magnificent 9-story Ludgate House, built to accommodate the best in computer-aided newspaper production. 4 editorial floors accommodate the Daily Express, its sister paper, the Daily Star, the Sunday Express, and the Express Colour magazine. Ludgate House is the control centre for the entire 7-days-a-week operation, which produces nearly 20 million copies of Express publications each week. Every night, editorial decisions are relayed to the sophisticated printing plants in London and Lancashire and converted into tomorrow's newspapers. In that first Daily Express, Pearson produced a brilliant innovation: news on the front page. He also scored a remarkable scoop, a message of goodwill from the German Emperor himself. There was an impressive array of datelines from around the world. It claimed an initial print order of 1.5 million. It had offices in Shoe Lane. It cost 1 halfpenny, and it proclaimed its editorial policy to be simply the British Empire. The Daily Express had arrived. By 1904, Pearson had acquired other newspapers in London and the provinces, among them the Evening Standard. In 1906, his eyesight failing, Pearson gave up the editor's chair at the Daily Express and appointed in his place a young London-based American journalist, Ralph Blumenfeld. Blumenfeld stayed with the paper for more than 40 years. In the early years, there was no shortage of news. New inventions, new kings, new politics, and new tragedies were there in abundance. In a blizzard of words, the papers recorded the ending of the Edwardian era and the gathering shadows of war. On the Express, tragedy had already struck. Arthur Pearson, its founder, was going blind. He sold his newspaper interests, including the Evening Standard, and withdrew from Fleet Street, to concentrate his energies on developing St Dunstan's. He was knighted in 1916 and died in 1921. But in the meantime, as it emerged from the glitter of the Edwardian era, the Daily Express was in deep financial trouble. Changes in the ownership of the Express have usually coincided with changes in the style, the shape, or the content of the product. Its acquisition by United Newspapers in 1985 came at a time of immense change throughout the national newspaper industry. For the first time this century, newspapers were forced to a radical rethink of the ways their papers were made. The advance of technology made it inevitable that traditional methods would have to be abandoned. The input remains the same. What goes into the paper is largely decided at the evening conference, where the editor meets with his senior executives to discuss the makeup of his next edition.
Diana's hair wasn't moving too much. Now, in light of what Charles said yesterday about banning hairsprays from his homes, including Kensington Park.
Hundreds of craftsmen played a part in the production of a newspaper. That's the way the game has always been played. But the computer has changed the rules.
What's simply happened is that we've got to replant. We've got to go to modern forms of technology, to a new way and a cheaper way of producing the newspaper. And that involves direct input by journalists. Now, to do that, we really need a new building because we need to computerise ourselves totally.
The final decisions are made by the editor. The way those decisions are translated into print was the big question that hung over the whole of Fleet Street in the late 1980s. The big question that hung over the Daily Express halfway through World War I was simply survival. In 1916, the Express was selling around 250,000 copies a day. The Daily Mirror, with its striking front-page photographs, was selling 1 million. With debts of £40,000 and problems in paying its newsprint suppliers, the Daily Express was on the point of closure. In desperation, Blumenfeld turned to Max Aitken, a Canadian adventurer who'd just been ennobled as Lord Beaverbrook for services to the war effort. Now Blumenfeld offered Beaverbrook a controlling interest in the Express for £17,500, provided he would also take on the paper's outstanding debts. In November 1916, after consulting Northcliffe, Beaverbrook agreed. The armistice in November 1918 brought with it a surge of optimism which affected everyone, including Beaverbrook. A month after the end of the war, he launched the Sunday Express and worked vigorously on both his papers at their Shoe Lane offices. In all, he ploughed more than £2 million into the paper before it began to break even. But by 1922, he turned the Daily Express around to profit by eye-catching displays of photojournalism, the use of bigger, bolder headlines, and by raising the cover price to 1 penny. Soon afterwards, he added the Evening Standard and a number of other papers to his list. And in 1927, the circulation of the Daily Express hit 1 million. In time, Beaverbrook would become the most powerful proprietor in Fleet Street, a capricious master, a dictatorial perfectionist, a millionaire with an insatiable appetite for the trivia of his newspapers, a brute of a man, a burden that had to be shouldered by all his editors. One of them, Robert Edwards, remembers.
Beaverbrook was a very fearsome figure in some ways. He was very powerful. you desperately wanted to work for him. And if you were an editor, you could have a very, very harassing time with him. He used to send notes on tiny pieces of paper, masses of them. Sometimes you get 10 or 12 in the morning mail delivered from Cherkley, and every single one had to be answered.
It cost Beaverbrook £17,500 to buy the controlling interest in the Daily Express in 1916. It cost his successors £300 million to reshape Express newspapers and equip them with the computer technology required to compete in the daily newspaper market in the 1990s. But if the hardware has been replaced by something more sophisticated, there are some aspects of the newspaper business which do not change. One of them is the flow of stories. From high drama to low comedy, from tragedy to farce, newspapers still manage to capture an essence of human life across the world, day by day, week by week, year by year. The Daily Express has been doing it for 9 decades. The circulation of the Daily Express in 1930 was around 1.6 million. Its new editor was, like its owner, a Canadian, Beverly Baxter. The paper was well laid out, used photographs prominently, had developed a worldwide news-gathering organization, and still cost 1 penny. Then in 1930, there occurred a tragic event, which ironically was to preface a golden future for the Daily Express. The British airship R101 was on its maiden flight to India when it crashed in France at 2 a.m. on the morning of Sunday, October the 5th, a time when the London Sunday papers and their editors had already gone to bed. But not the Sunday Express. Its deputy editor hurtled back into the newsroom, stripped out the front page and splashed the story with pictures. He organized special late editions which scooped every one of his rivals totally. It's one of the legends of Fleet Street. The editor who conjured that small miracle was the 26-year-old Arthur Christensen. His handling of that night's events marked him for stardom. Within 3 years, he was editor of the Daily Express. He stayed for 24 years and saw the Express through its days of greatest triumph. But just a few months before Christensen's scoop, the Daily Express acquired the emblem for which it's still famous, the Crusader. It first appeared on March the 29th, 1930. The Crusader was Beaverbrook's idea. A passionate advocate of empire-free trade, a sort of tariff barrier aimed at protecting trade throughout the British Empire, he hoisted the Crusader logo onto the Express masthead as a permanent reminder of his campaign. For years, he hammered away at his theme, hiring writers and ordering thunderous editorials. In the end, the idea died, along with Beaverbrook and the Empire itself. But the Crusader remains, a proud symbol of the long history of the Daily Express. Beaverbrook left one other mark on newspaper history, the Daily Express building in Fleet Street. It was started in 1931. Out of the rubble of old humdrum buildings rose the magnificent black glass and chrome edifice which still stands near Ludgate Circus. Original in concept and design, it vividly reflected the flair and style of the Daily Express itself. The frontage of the building, the spiral staircase, and the magnificent metal sculptings which dominate both sides of the lobby have rightly been preserved for posterity. By the time the new building had been completed, the Sunday Express was a money-maker. Its editor was John Gordon, a blunt-speaking Scot and former Daily Express chief sub, who found success by aiming his paper directly at a solid, respectable family readership, and it was selling 1 million a week.
The Sunday Express readers were like gold in the bank. They didn't want adventures into pornography. They didn't want revelations of choir boys and vicars. They wanted a newspaper which they could leave around for their 10-year-olds, 11-year-olds to read. And that integrity, of course, is worth a damn sight more.
For nearly 60 years, the Sunday Express would take over the Daily Express newsroom in the Fleet Street building on Saturday nights to prepare for publication. True to John Gordon's precept, later followed by Sir John Junior, the Sunday Express was based on regular and familiar content. Sport, politics, humour, honest reporting and a good read. They were the virtues which took the Sunday Express to sales of over 3 million by the time John Gordon retired in 1952, and 4 million at its peak. The Christensen era saw the Daily Express emerge as Fleet Street's front runner. No expense was spared in making this newspaper what in 1936 it claimed to be, the biggest newspaper in the world. With Beaverbrook as overlord, another Canadian, E.J. Robertson, as general manager, and Christensen as editor, it was unassailable. It was the start of a golden age, when the Express made all the running in Fleet Street, and when to be an Express staffer was to have reached the top.
The triumvirate of E.J. Robertson, Lord Beaverbrook, E.J. Robertson and Arthur Christensen, there's never been anything like it in Fleet Street and never will be again.
I believe that he was the greatest editor I've ever worked for. He was human, ruthless, strong, and very intelligent. I liked him very much.
We really did believe that our paper was the greatest paper, and if you said that you worked for the Daily Express, you held your head high in Fleet Street.
It was rather like playing for Middlesex at Lord's in its heyday, or playing for the Arsenal when they were the top of the league up at Highbury. That was what it was like. You were playing in the first division for the best team and the best skipper.
Beaverbrook was never afraid to bang the drum for his paper. This 1937 column called the Express the world's largest daily newspaper and listed its income and outgoings. Modern economists would be horrified to see that from an income of over £5 million in a year, the Express made a profit of only £150,000. The significant costs in 1937 were paper and ink, wages, mechanical staff, together over £2 million. The ruinous cost of hot metal printing was to become the crucial factor in forcing change on the newspaper industry 50 years later. But in the 30s, it didn't matter. The Express was irresistibly successful, and it set out to attract those who wanted to live the life it reflected so well.
Beaverbrook created its policy with that great editor, Arthur Christensen, who put it into operation. But the policy was, let us cover all the Paris fashions. People want to live a greater life. Everybody wants to be wealthy. We're dealing with a paper for a family that wants 2 cars and can get them. It was all very much upstage, upmarket. Well, after a while, this tinsel journalism, and I think it's fair to call it that, was seen through by the very people it was supposed to flatter. And that is when the Daily Express started getting wrong, because of the realism, just that simple word, the realism of the Daily Express, close to the public and its problems.
Rupert Bear made his first appearance in the Daily Express on November the 8th, 1920, and has never stopped since. In fact, Rupert is the longest-running strip cartoon in the world. Rupert Bear was an inspired piece of newspaper marketing. He reached and held a very important sector of the readership. Today, he's still the item many people turn to first. The Rupert Annual, first published in 1936, still sells 200,000 copies every year. Tradition has it that Rupert must appear in every frame of the strip. This makes it difficult for the artist to maintain the storyline, but it has to be that way, or the Express is buried in complaints from an army of Rupert Bear purists. Nobody wanted war in 1939, so Beaverbrook confirmed to his readers that it would never happen. It was a laughable error of judgment. But once the war overtook the nation, Fleet Street responded with all the skill and imagination that the blitz, censorship, and strictly rationed newsprint would allow. Often reduced to a mere 4 pages, the Express still managed to present the news with all the flair and dash which had long characterized the paper. And its war correspondents always did their best within the rules to get their stories past the military censors. Norman Smart was one of them. He was aboard HMS Ark Royal when the most famous aircraft carrier in the fleet was sunk by German torpedoes.
Well, we were about 30 miles from Gibraltar in the Ark, and we were suddenly torpedoed, and it got through to London and was a world scoop. It covered the whole front page of the Daily Express.
After this was...
Oh, I got a cable. I think I've still got it. Tremendous. Saying what a wonderful scoop it was.
The art of circulation boosting has been part of the newspaper industry since the 1920s. All papers do it, and Express newspapers are no exception. Promotion is done with great style these days, in contrast with the rather crude giveaways through which papers in the 1930s tried to lure their readers. Occasionally, marketing will embrace a real contribution to the good of society, as with the Daily Express Helicopter Emergency Service, a fully equipped emergency operating theatre and air ambulance which is on permanent call to major accidents anywhere within a radius of 25 miles of central London. Express Newspapers bought and equipped the helicopter in 1988 and is underwriting all its operational costs as a public service. But the whole promotional scene reached a frantic peak in the 1980s, when most of Fleet Street set out to give away enormous sums of money to lucky readers. The Daily Express, the Sunday Express and the Star simply offered to make someone a millionaire in a moment. And they did. Throughout the turbulent 50s and into the 60s, the Express continued to provide top-class coverage of news events across the world.
News coverage was incomparable. If you had a great liner on fire or an aeroplane crashing or anything horrible like that, or a train crash, I remember the Lewisham train crash, I was editor or deputy editor, and I used to watch with awe how brilliantly the staff did it. And how magnificently the printers performed too in getting the paper out on time. We were all chums, you know. And if we weren't at war with each other, the journalists and the printers, not on the Express.
Sales boomed. It was calculated that 15 million people across the country read the Daily Express every morning. It was indeed the world's greatest newspaper, the one all journalists wanted to work for.
Oh yes, it was very humbling, because you thought you knew quite a lot from the provincial area you came from, and you suddenly learned that you knew nothing at all, that you were learning from absolute masters of the craft. And the Daily Express had its fair share of those.
We all believed that it was the greatest paper to work for. We were treated like the greatest people. I mean, we were given, marvellous herograms and also big rockets. I mean, you know, the balance, but you were made to believe you were work for the best newspaper.
I mean, photo news became one of the great picture spreads of Fleet Street, and often copied but never duplicated, I might say.
And when I came to the expenses to put them in, I put into entertaining threepence. And Norman Smart, the news editor, came out of the room and said, "Is there anyone here called Leesaw?" And I stood up. He said, "What's all this threepence for entertaining?" And I was going to say, "I'm sorry, I swindled you, I'll go quietly." And he said, "This is the Daily Express, make it £1 and threepence." From that start, I think we never looked back.
By then, the great Arthur Christensen had gone. He'd taken every kind of accolade and insult from Beaverbrook for 24 years, only to be pushed into oblivion in 1957 with no word of thanks. He died in 1963 at the age of 59. Roy Wright, later to edit the paper, was first hired by Christensen.
I always likened him to a contemporary of his, C.B. Cochrane in show business, because there was a great element in the Daily Express, particularly Christensen's editorship, of a sort of high-definition showbiz glitz. And Chris was a great director of this, and that was why it had this unique glamour about it. It wasn't just authority or brilliance, it was a glamorous, glitzy newspaper. And that was the result of Christensen's ruling it like a sort of brilliant circus director or impresario.
His successor was Edward, later Sir Edward Pickering, who proved to be as capable as anyone who's ever sat in the editor's chair, and who was there when the Express reached its highest ever circulation figure of 4,388,867 copies a day in the month of June 1961.
Those days we had 23 machines, which were maximum speeds then at 26,000 an hour. And it was a real hard slog, it really was.
What Pickering inherited, among other things, was a superb foreign service. Express staff men were in all the important centres of the world, and other specialists were available at any time to fly to the scene of any story.
Indeed, I think we had something like about 26 foreign correspondents around the world, certainly larger than the Times and the Telegraph, and certainly larger than even the BBC.
But with great correspondents like Rennie McCall, Sidney Smith, just to mention a couple of them, once you'd got them on the move and got them there, it was easy.
If the front pages of the Daily Express were the envy of Fleet Street, the back page was its match. Sports coverage received the big treatment in words and pictures.
The backbone of the sports desk was the racing department. Racing sold the paper, really did. We had a most wonderful team that's ever been. It'll never be the same again. We had Clive Graham, this boy who came straight from Eton into racing, Peter O'Sullivan, who have, since we know his wonderful career.
You felt that you were living like a prince, and what they paid you was nothing at all. You felt, if I were a millionaire, I'd done it for nothing, except a millionaire couldn't have had the advantages I had. And there's such tremendous encouragement and enthusiasm. It was said once, if you want to know the value of the sports page of the Daily Express, read the other papers.
Crisp writing, slick subbing, good pictures well displayed. They were the ingredients that made the Express what it was as it entered the fast and furious 1960s. The leader of the bunch. It's often been said that William Maxwell Aitken, better known as Lord Beaverbrook, had a touch of genius. Certainly he excelled at many things, none more than journalism, where he not only had a good eye for a story, but was good at recognizing talent in others. Whatever it was in the way of leadership that he gave the newspapers he owned, it suddenly vanished on June the 9th, 1964. Beaverbrook died.
Beaverbrook was one of those most useful, I think, really, of proprietors. He began life selling Canadian bonds, but he ended up as a very promising journalist and then a great journalist. And he really, I mean, though Christensen edited the paper and John Gordon brilliantly edited the Sunday Express, the moving spirit behind the policy of those papers was Beaverbrook, and Beaverbrook was really the editor-in-chief.
For reasons that nobody can quite define, the death of Beaverbrook marked the moment the Daily Express began to slip from the summit. Circulation fell slowly but steadily after 1965. The paper looked the same and did the same things, but the magic had somehow faded away. Derek Marks was appointed editor in 1965, the first major decision taken by Beaverbrook's son and heir, Max Aitken. Max was 54 when he inherited Beaverbrook newspapers. He'd worked in the company most of his life after gallant service as a Second World War fighter pilot. But although nominal chairman of Beaverbrook newspapers, he'd lived entirely in his father's shadow. His real interest lay in yachting and racing, and he made no secret of preferring cows to Fleet Street. And for the first time, the economics of the industry, and in particular the eternal problems of chronic overmanning and union confrontation, were seriously affecting the Express. In Beaverbrook's day, there'd always been money to throw at any problems with the print unions. Now, damaging industrial disputes were eating away at reserves, accelerating the decline. Only 5 years after his father's death, it was necessary for Max Aitken to reassure his staff that the papers had a future. In the staff newspaper, Crusader, he revealed that the company had spent £12 million on new buildings and equipment, and would have to spend as much again to remain competitive. Economies forced the closure of the Scottish print operation, and by the mid-70s, express sales were down to under 3 million. The cost of producing the newspapers was rising alarmingly. In 1973, the company was paying £12 million for its newsprint. The following year, it shot up to 21 million. The company fell into deep debt, and its bankers warned them that they would allow no further credit. There were even serious talks about a merger between the Daily Express and its bitterest rival, the Daily Mail. But at the last moment, Max Aitken pulled back. Meantime, there was despair and indecision in the boardroom, and it showed. Having had only 4 editors in its first 50 years, the Express was now changing editors with confusing regularity. Bob Edwards did the job twice. Roger Wood held the title for a year. Then came Ian McCall in 1971, Alistair Burnett in 1974, and Roy Wright, deputy to Burnett, in 1976.
Well, I think what happened to the editorships is kind of indicative of what really went wrong with the paper over a number of years, is that they never quite seemed to know what sort of a newspaper it should be.
It fell to Wright to engineer the greatest change in the history of the Daily Express. The decision to go tabloid was taken in 1976, and the first edition was published on January the 24th, 1977. With Express circulation now down to 2.5 million, it was a fairly desperate gamble.
The circulation was falling, and more important than that, the finances of the paper were crumbling. They got enormous debts, and I think things were getting pretty desperate. And they tried. I think the board generally thought, well, we've tried everything else, and it doesn't seem to work. Why not let's go tabloid like the Daily Mail did and see what happens?
What happened was that the circulation continued to fall, and the overdraft at the bank continued to rise. Only 6 months after the enormous effort of turning the Daily Express into a tabloid, the gamble was lost. Desperate to avoid the collapse of the company and the closure of the titles, Max Aitken and his managers turned to an old friend. Victor Matthews was a Daily Express reader. He was also boss of the construction firm of Trollope & Coles, which had always been Beaverbrook's builders. Now chief executive of the giant Trafalgar House Group, he was urged by Max Aitken to save the Express from ruin by buying it. After a month of talking, Trafalgar House agreed and paid just £13.7 million for what had been the world's greatest newspaper, its Sunday companion, the Evening Standard, and all their plant and buildings. The condition was that the papers would be run by Victor Matthews alone.
We discussed it, and I said, well, who's going to run it? And he said, well, Victor, you'll have to run it. And I was actually horrified at that. Bear in mind, I was nearly 60 at that stage. And as you say, on the second bottle of wine in the Ritz, in the restaurant there, which is a glorious place, the sun was shining. And so I said, all right, I'll do it. But that was after the second bottle.
Until the 1960s, London was able to support 3 evening newspapers. The Evening News, owned by the Daily Mail, the Star, sister paper to the News Chronicle, and the Evening Standard, owned by Beaverbrook. The Star was the first to give way to the financial pressures which swept through Fleet Street in the early 1960s. the Standard and the Evening News slugged it out on the streets for years.
But we had a much more focused idea of what the readership was than either the Evening News or the Star. I mean, we were looking at people who were interested in the city, in the arts and in politics and of course in sport. And I think that we produced quite a high-class paper at that time.
London. Every great city has its own newspaper. London, perhaps the greatest city, has a great newspaper, the London Standard. With updated editions.
Even though superhuman efforts by its staff brought the Standard into profit for a while, the cost of keeping both evenings going was enormous. Finally, the Evening News folded, and by arrangement, the Standard eventually passed into the hands of the Mail Group.
City. It's tingling fresh.
The arrival of commercial television in Britain in 1955 was barely recognised by the Daily Express. While Lord Thomson, owner of the Times, bought into television and crowed it was a licence to print money, Beaverbrook ignored it. Yet as television took a grip of the nation's leisure habits in the 1960s and 70s and began to attract more and more advertising to the screen and away from the printed page, the effects were felt right across Fleet Street. Not only the Express, but all other newspapers felt the effect of falling sales and decreasing revenue. The impact closed an armful of titles. Television had changed reading habits, and more important, advertising habits. It took time for the newspaper industry to come to terms with the new conditions, but when it did, the answer was the triumphantly successful colour supplement.
Okay, on to June 19. So we know about the McEnroe story, that's in the bag, that's great relief. But the big one is the London Philharmonic Orchestra. Now Louette's done the copy, that's in, isn't it? Yeah. And very good, I read it over the weekend, it's fabulous.
The Sunday Express magazine was not launched until April 1981, but quickly became established as a very valuable element within Express newspapers.
David, how many pages are we going to give this? Full of action.
You
It's
like
McEnroe.
Corner flash for the orchestra?
Yeah, can we get one in there?
Oh yes.
Big one?
Nice diagonal to go with the body.
Terrific. Let me see. Sunday Express magazine last year made more in display revenue than any other magazine in the UK. £54 million. So it's an enormous financial contribution.
Advertising revenue has always been the motive power behind newspapers. Such was the emphasis 90 years ago that until the Daily Express came along, all papers put advertising on the front page. With the arrival of the colour magazine and the technical advance of spot-accurate colour printing, advertising has rediscovered the power of the press as a medium to carry a message.
Royal Doulton is, it stands for all of the elegance and beauty of fine bone china. What we're trying to achieve in this ad is to try and capitalise on the fact that fine bone china is more accessible now to a wider audience of people for lots of reasons. Right, initially, colour magazines, especially colour supplements, were primarily an advertising vehicle. The Sunday Express magazine, and in fact the Sunday Express newspaper, historically always stood for tradition.
The Sunday Express magazine just happens to perform very well against our target. It matches our 40-plus sort of serious investor very well and builds coverage well. So we use that and about 2 or 3 others to go into the mix.
This is the Montego Countryman, latest ad from Don and Stu. It's a special edition based on the 1.6 and 2 litre L versions of the estate. And so we're not just talking to the men, we're also talking to women, and we believe that the purchase of this car will be a joint decision between the two of them.
It's a very important part of our overall strategy and very important for Montego. But in fact, for the estate, we didn't use television. We concentrated the money into press and into post.
We have incredible loyalty. 51% of our readers see nothing else on a Sunday. That's any other Sunday supplement at all, which is quite incredible. So you can't reach those people any other way.
Computer power makes it easier for the small advertiser too. With the help of well-trained operators here in Express Newspaper's Small Ads Department at Ludgate House, callers can talk their ads straight onto the page.
The future I anticipate with great excitement. It seems to me that we have, within reason, dragged ourselves through the last decade. And having said that, I'm intensely proud of what we've done, both in this company and in Fleet Street in general. We have all come through a metamorphosis in a very short period of time.
In the 6 years following Lord Matthew's takeover, there were 4 changes of editor on the Daily Express. Derek Jameson, Arthur Firth, Christopher Ward, and Sir Larry Lamb, hot from the Sun, where he'd given page 3 a new meaning in the English language. Nothing any of them did could arrest the downward drift of the Daily Express, even Jameson, who made a typically determined effort.
When I arrived, they were selling 2 million copies, declining. The advertising department had to tell the customers, the advertisers, that if we dip below 2 million, we'll give you a rebate. And it was desperate stakes, you know. It was going down, down, down. So I arrived with the writ, stop the decline, turn the circulation round. And on day 1, I said, OK, right, every headline must go up a size, and every picture must be at least a column bigger. And those 2 simple tactics immediately transformed the look of the paper. It began to look far more bright, vigorous, urgent, tabloidy.
2 days to go and a new star is born. The Daily Star, Britain's boldest, brashest, brightest new paper. Star beauties to leave you starry-eyed. All action, star sport. Star fun that puts a gleam in your eye. Star pictures to put a sparkle in your day. And thank your lucky star for those big star prizes. All in the Daily Star, the new national paper from the North.
The Daily Star burst onto the breakfast tables of Britain on November the 2nd, 1978. Based in Manchester, where spare printing capacity at the Express plant offered economic advantages for the launch of a new daily, the Star was aimed at the rich market for popular papers so well exploited by the Sun and Mirror.
It's got to be Britain's best buy, and it's only 6pence.
This paper has been going for 8 years now, and it was started up in the north, here in Manchester, primarily to soak up spare capacity of labour and printing facilities. But although it's been very successful up here, the fact that it was seen as a northern paper, for one thing, hampered its development in the south more than a little bit. And now that we're able to move into this super new building in Blackfriars Road, straight on the banks of the Thames, we can move the entire journalistic operation from here down there.
But for all that the Star was fun, the serious side of Fleet Street loomed all too often, with strikes and union confrontations creating periodic chaos throughout the newspaper industry. Outdated union attitudes, ancient rule books, Spanish customs, bloody-mindedness, poor management, all had contributed to a history of anarchy, as Andrew Cameron, managing director of Express Newspapers, recalls.
It was very unfunny. At one point we had a total of 43 negotiating sections in London, 42 in Manchester and 9 in Glasgow. Each of those sections on withdrawal of labour could stop the business. I think blind eyes were turned to the actual number of men who attended on a night's production in the interests of continuing production at a time when the economics of the business were disastrous.
But the onset of new technology, already accepted on many provincial newspapers but not in Fleet Street, was soon to overwhelm even the most entrenched unions. Lord Matthews, the bluff baron who'd risen from the building site to the chairman's chair, had already begun to challenge the strength of the unions.
Victor Matthews brought in the law for the first time in Fleet Street, and he, on a number of occasions, went to the courts to obtain injunctions to prevent trade unions from stopping production or stopping increased production in Fleet Street. And he was very successful in that line. He didn't win everyone, but he won quite a few. And I think he was a much more significant figure in Fleet Street than people realised.
Thanks perhaps to his lead, managements began to hammer out new agreements which breached the walls of printing tradition and practice. At the Express, computerized typesetting and plate-making processes were to become the first small steps towards updating production. More important, a new realism was about to descend on the industry, typified by the new man who took charge of Express newspapers in September 1985, David Stevens. His United Newspaper Group had long been run on modern methods and had rationalized its manning levels while introducing computerized equipment. As Lord Stevens saw it, the same could be done in Fleet Street.
We proved that in United Newspapers you could do it. We reduced the manpower by 35% in 4 years. I was told by those in the know that that could not be achieved, and indeed other regional newspapers were starting to do it at the same time. We brought in modern production methods, and in the whole of that period, until now, we've only lost 1 day's production in the whole of United Newspapers. It was clear, I think, I would say really to any thinking man or woman, that Fleet Street was the next area where clearly this process had to occur. People had talked about it for many years. Most people in Fleet Street had 2 jobs. The NGA people were working 16 hours a week for £50,000 a year in our plant. They were having 8 weeks holiday. We said in August '85, in the middle of the takeover bid for Fleet, which owned Express, that we reduced the manpower by 35%.
The groundwork for changes to the union-dominated structure of the newspaper industry had already been laid by Eddie Shah. His legal challenge to union power enabled him to launch the computerized daily newspaper Today, later to be rescued from collapse by Rupert Murdoch's News International Group. Shah's foray into national newspapers had been a sad failure, but his legacy enabled all newspaper managements to think of investing in long overdue modernization and reducing manning levels. Furthermore, on the weekend that Express newspapers presented its plans for reorganization to its workforce in January 1986, Rupert Murdoch dropped the whopping bombshell by moving his entire production process overnight, from outmoded Fleet Street to brand new purpose-built plant in London's Docklands. Despite violent opposition from some print union members, the realities of a new situation finally prevailed. At Express newspapers, management and unions met and argued. Tough terms were presented by both sides: drastic manpower cuts, redundancy pay, realistic work practices, the right of management to manage. It was all part of a great reshaping of an industry.
We'd said all along that recognising from our own experience that Fleet Street is a jungle, and it was a jungle, that when one newspaper moved to new technology, the others just couldn't stand on the sidelines and do nothing at all. So we knew that when one moved, the rest would follow.
I don't think any compensation for the loss of employment and the loss of future jobs is adequate or enough. But certainly we reached an agreement with the Express that we really wouldn't complain about or carp about.
In the end, the Express newspaper's workforce was cut from 7,000 people to just under 2,000. It happened smoothly and without industrial disruption. It was a victory for common sense, and it came at exactly the right time. Andrew Cameron puts it in perspective.
Well, by the mid-1980s, the turnovers of the companies were significant, but the amount of money that actually stuck in terms of profit available for reinvestment, available for dividend, was virtually nil. Our projections for 1986 showed a loss on a turnover of 280 million ad express newspapers of over £6 million. The crunch had come. Another year of trading in that fashion and the company would have been bankrupt.
All Fleet Street was to find keeping pace with progress an expensive business. It cost express newspapers £300 million to buy a fresh start, 140 million in redundancy payments and 160 million for new plant, equipment and buildings. While the pace of change gathered momentum, the flow of words and pictures never ceased. The newspapers worked their daily miracle and got the news to the nation in time for breakfast. But it became clear that in order to incorporate new direct input technology, the Crusader would have to leave Fleet Street and find a new centralized, purpose-built home somewhere else.
I don't know whether anybody wants to make any comment on where they feel the location should be.
A committee of department heads was charged with nothing less than preparing express newspapers for the 21st century. And first, they had to select a site on which to build a brand new headquarters.
It would seem sensible to me that we should build our own building or build it in conjunction with someone else and have an equity stake in it.
Yes.
The committee then began planning in detail how to move the Daily Express, the Sunday Express, the Star and the Magazine out of their old offices in London and Manchester with the minimum of disruption. At the same time, new printing plants were being built at Broughton in Lancashire and West Ferry on the River Thames, while the existing plant in Manchester was being expanded. 20 Goss T70 offset printing presses were ordered to ensure the papers had the latest colour-on-the-run printing machinery at their disposal. The changeover involved everything: editorial, printing, distribution, finance, communications, training, personnel, engineering, advertising, security, maintenance, purchasing, stores, accounts, library, catering. Every single component of Express newspapers' operation, large and small, had to be studied minutely and allotted its place in the reconstruction. The new Express headquarters, long, slim and 9 stories high. It's on a narrow site fronting the Thames between Blackfriars Road and Blackfriars Railway Bridge. Work began in autumn 1987 to make this the most modern newspaper office in London. The architect was Gerald West.
But we're delighted now because we do reflect the very strong image. Everybody knows the Daily Express building. It's a very famous London building, and I think this building is going to suit them very well from that point of view.
By the summer of 1988, the building was taking recognizable shape amid the detritus of construction. Lord Stevens visited the new headquarters to take a look at his future office and to check the progress of an enormous investment in the future.
It's very impressive.
And you'll be able to come by river as well if you want.
We can go by river down to our printing plant.
That's right.
Down in Westbury.
Yes.
The Star had been born in Manchester, and it was still a Manchester newspaper. Its people were from the north, and so was the bulk of its readership. Moving it all down to London involved a certain amount of heartbreak for some of the staff, plus an element of risk to the paper itself. Yet there was nothing but optimism from editor Brian Hitchin as plans for the move took shape in 1988.
The people who are moving, when we move the back bench from here down to London, most of them will be coming with me. Some of them didn't want to, first of all, but I was fortunate in that I have, I suppose, been able to gather around me a very good and loyal team. They are a super team. And I'd back, really, any of them against anything in Fleet Street. They are very good people indeed, very professional.
Okay, Rachel, we've built the ad system as far as we can. Let's see if we can get it to work.
At the Express, the mysterious business of translating layouts, typefaces, and 1,000 other elements of design and content into computer language had begun. Experts on the 4th floor were making this transformation, while at the new building, still known only as 245 Blackfriars Road, wiring was being laid by the mile. The countdown to a £300 million future was on. One area which required early planning was the Cuttings and Pictures Library. At a computer program centre at Milton Keynes, a staff of 24 people worked 18 hours a day to put 2 million library cuttings onto computer disks. At the same time, Express library staff were taught to operate the system which enables writers and subs to pull cuttings directly onto their computer screens. Computer training was mandatory for all staff. Reporters, subs, news and picture editors, and the backbenchers of all papers were obliged to learn the routines of direct input. Jean Rook began to write her column on computer, and Express editor Nick Lloyd went back to basics for a day or so to master the new technology.
Okay, no press notes.
April 1989. The big decisions have been made. Now the tens of thousands of items, from computers to curtain rails, from lifts to light bulbs, are arriving in a ceaseless flow at the newly named Ludgate House. In the squeaky clean newsroom, the slimmed-down committee which planned it all holds its first meeting at the new address. Andrew Cameron presides.
Well, welcome to 245 Blackfriars Road. First meeting in our new building. Shall we say, the building having been delivered on time, on schedule and on budget. Thank you, gentlemen. Apart from Ray Wiles' flanges, of course.
Soon, and for the first time, all Express newspapers' publications would be under one roof.
Oh, the move will be tremendous. Also, I think that we will all have great fun in that we'll be masters of our own destiny journalistically. In other words, you know, it's direct input. You know, you sit there with your keyboard, and what you put in is what you get back. You know, we don't have to go through all the systems and people that we had before. So that's a great step forward.
While Ludgate House was being built and equipped, the new press hall at Broughton took shape on the edge of a Lancashire moor. Soon afterwards, the West Ferry site, jointly owned by Express newspapers and the Daily Telegraph, was prepared for the arrival of the presses on which southern editions of the Express, Star and Sunday Express are now printed. The Sunday Express was the last of all the newspapers to leave Fleet Street. The friendly family paper, in which not too much had been altered as the years rolled by, was suddenly to find itself overtaken by fundamental change. For one thing, a new editor, Robin Morgan.
The Sunday Express has its place in the 90s and into the next century because it has traditional values that are actually going to return to Britain after the aspirational 8 years of leisure pursuit and the pursuit of money and wealth. I think the people of the 90s are actually going to be pursuing a more caring image, and they're going to be pursuing a lifestyle which shows that they are more caring, and they want that reflected in their newspapers.
In crossing the river to new pastures, the Sunday Express would take with it some new ideas and many of its old traditions. The crackle of the crossbencher column, for example, and the gentle humour of the one and only Giles. The early hours of Sunday, April the 9th, 1989, and months of preparation were over. The time had come for the Crusader to leave Fleet Street.
I had never been in the Daily Express building beyond the rather lovely exterior and the wonderful Art Deco lobby until I was made editor. And I came up here, editor of the Daily Express. I strode beyond the lifts and suddenly into this newsroom and thought, oh my God, because here we were in this sort of rather tatty rabbit warren full of sort of army surplus furniture. And it wasn't the grand, clean, wonderful sort of television style office one expected, but it certainly has character.
Well, it's sad, but we must go forward into the future. Let's go and see the future in the 1990s and look at our new building, shall we? Lovely.
And quite suddenly, the lights in the Daily Express Fleet Street building went out for the last time. They had come in convoys and carried away van loads of those unconsidered trifles journalists need to make an office into a newsroom. Files, letters, coat hangers, pictures, cups, books, ballpoints, souvenirs, cuttings, handouts and diaries. All this and more packed in crates and driven across Blackfriars Bridge and into a new world. Left behind were redundant typewriters and desks, favourite chairs, in-trays and out-trays, and several tons of paper. And for those still calling Fleet Street 8000, a reminder that on April the 9th, 1989, things had changed.
Got a news desk for you. Good morning, Express newspapers.
In moving to Ludgate House, the Daily Express crossed the gulf between hot metal and the computer age. The Star made the same leap, but arrived via Manchester. Both completed the trip without any serious disruption.
Absolutely magnificent. Superb. We came over the river, as you know. We moved in on Saturday morning at 7:30, boxes, baggies, the whole lot, like a camel train coming over it. And we've actually picked up on the new edition without missing a heartbeat. We had the conference at 10:30 sharp this morning, everybody in, everybody working beautifully. It's gone like clockwork.
For 50 years, the presses beneath the Express building had pumped out untold millions of newspapers. Even with the newsrooms gone, they were still willing to put on their nightly performance. They were to be the last elements to be displaced by new technology. In the meantime, coaxed with loving care, these old war horses charged gallantly into battle night after night. They were finally retired on Friday, November the 17th, 1989. And anyone who was anyone on Fleet Street came to pay them tribute. To these old machines fell the privilege of producing the last papers ever to be printed in Fleet Street. At Broughton and West Ferry, it was just another night. Another 350 tons of newsprint transformed into millions of morning newspapers. Just another night. The night the Crusader rode into the future. Ludgate House is now the headquarters of Express newspapers. And a visit by the Prime Minister in June 1989 made it official.
Declare open this magnificent building, Ludgate House.
I feel that when I took this job and when United started to invest in the business, we were given the three tasks that you mentioned in the very beginning. Firstly, we had to dramatically reduce the manpower, we had to increase the working hours, we had to get rid of the Spanish customs, we had to produce in the modern world.
Great future. I mean, I think that one, we can already see that we can make changes, news changes, to pages later. It's quicker, in other words, for us to do it than it was to do it the old-fashioned way. So that's going to give a better news service to the readers.
We're on a high, there's a lot, we feel very positive. We're going to be redesigning the magazine to a certain extent for the new year and working on how we can go on improving it and present the readers with an even better, even brighter and even more brilliant product than before.
I have no regrets about leaving Fleet Street. Fleet Street to me is a generic term. It means good journalists. And where good journalists are, there's Fleet Street. And right now, Fleet Street is here at 245 Blackfriars Road, the Daily Star.
It'll take time, But I believe the Sunday Express will in the 90s have a reputation. It will build a reputation that will match the logo on the front, on the masthead. And that is a reputation for crusading journalism, a reputation for reliable journalism.
And I think it's a great reflection on the existing management of Express that they achieved that with, if you like, a little bit of assistance from me, but basically they proved that they could manage a business, and they'd been in waiting to manage a business. It's also a great reflection on the unions and the workforce that the whole of this was done with no disruption, and although it's unhappy to declare people redundant, I have to say with very little unpleasantness. And that's a great achievement all round.
The Express can look back with pride on 90 years of publication. Express newspapers can look forward with confidence to the future, for tomorrow's Crusader has the technology, the leadership, the skill and the dedication to match the challenge of the next 90 years.
No pictures.
Can I see your union card, please? Are you an authorised person to do this?
It is actually, it's getting more and more and more. Yeah, but the shortcuts and everything, you are doing it.
got your makeup on, Dick?
Cool, blimey. You put you after stimulate.
We're just going to get a picture out of there.
Money, we'll eat it again, mate. We had a machine paper here.
You like bastard.
Okay, we'll get it again. I'll pull the little plug out.
We had an operator failure, right? Ready?
Operator failure, yeah.
Cheerio, gentlemen. Ta-ra, Fred. See you again. Cheerio, Fred. Ta-ra, Fred. He's running in our borrowing, Fred.
Teas after teas.
I'll have one. Yeah, just in case he phones in the hobby, that's all.
Okay, have you got the rotors for what beginning the...
Oh, there's one here.
Yeah, that's okay. Oh, yes, sir. Sorry?
Excuse me if I was filming you.
Oh, I didn't realise that. Otherwise I'd have had my brick ready, you know. You what, ready?